Great.
Go for it.
Hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Annie Tarazi. As you can see in my Zoom name, I work at FCNL. I'm the Senior Manager of Events and Programming. And so one of the big aspects of my job that I'll be touching on today is talking about major events and conferences. So I'm excited to be here with you. Bobby?
Thanks, Annie. I'm the Quaker Engagement Associate on staff at FCNL and do a lot of work to curate online spaces for worship for members of our network affiliated with FCNL, and to also create other online Quaker spaces for various conversations and other forms of programming. I'm going to pass it back to Annie.
So we have a few minutes of prepared remarks just to go over some of the top line lessons that we've learned in our different roles through the last year of virtual events. It feels like this has been a lot of growth, really quickly happened in our understanding of how to put on virtual events at FCNL. So we're going to start with just a few minutes of us sort of chatting about some high level stuff. And then we really want to turn it over to allow it to be more of a conversation, especially since we've got, a tight group here. Hopefully we can keep it really casual. But just a little bit to understand about the types of events we're talking about. So some of the events that we are going to talk about, the two that we're going to talk about the most are ones that started as in-person events, but then moved online. But if you also have questions about events that were started online, that we innovated out of the need for online programming in the last year, we also have some experience in that. We're happy to talk about that. We do a lot of different kinds of events, as I mentioned. So I'm mostly going to be talking about major lobbying conferences where we also had business happen. And Bobby is really the mastermind behind a lot of our Quaker conversations and our weekly worship space. So he's done a lot of that work. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about FCNL's annual meeting, and Bobby is going to be talking about our weekly worship. Bobby?
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, and part of what we want to talk about in this conversation too is, how do you know that an online event is Quaker when you're meeting online? What are a few ways that you can sort of signal and recreate that Quaker flavor and sense of the gathering online? A few ways that we've tried to address this are, of course, sort of becoming conventions in the online Quaker space these days, but adding periods of grounding silence and waiting worship before you start programming, scheduling opportunities for worship and worship sharing if you're hosting a larger event like annual sessions, using queries in event materials and programming for worship, for participant reflection, and to break up sort of content-heavy programming to provide room for individuals to reflect and engage with the material and the content that's being presented. So those are just a few thoughts on signaling that. For our next little section, we're going to talk about really nuts and bolts of how we put together some of these online events.
So I would say when we're talking about online events, one of the big things that I hope you remember and that really helped me to understand was that you have to be even more prepared and have even more things scripted out and written down than you did when you were in person. It is just a lot harder to wing things on Zoom, and it becomes a lot more evident when you do. What does that mean? Like, for example, thinking about how you're going to take questions from the audience. Do you want to use the chat? Do you want to use the raise hand function? Is it small enough, like in this group, where if someone just does this, I can see them and call on them, and that feels natural to the group. So thinking through how you want sort of the flow of things to go and actually making those decisions in advance. You just want to really make sure that you have all the logistics there so that you're not preoccupied with that, really. And that's where I have found in working through annual meeting, that's really where spirit can come through, is once the logistics can sort of fall to the back. So you do a lot of that as pre-work. And I think Bobby has more to say about our run of show document.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really glad in the morning panel session that Peterson Toscano sort of pulled back the curtain and revealed that all of the panelists were working off of a shared script. And that's exactly what we're talking about here in terms of having a very detailed run of show is what we call it. So it's not just a script. It also includes tech cues for when someone needs to drop something in the chat or share screen of a particular visual. It includes times blocked off for each specific section of the programming that you're walking through with an audience, so that, with that level of detail, having all those cues, all those talking points sort of scripted out, it gets really also easy. It doesn't only keep everyone on the same page who's supposed to be there and working through the programming. It's also really helpful in case someone gets sick or has an internet connectivity issue to have all of that scripted out so someone can really just plug and play. You can call on a backup person to come out of the wings and take on a role that they weren't initially supposed to have because you've scripted it out so well that anyone can kind of rise to the occasion. Yeah, I'm gonna pass back to Annie now.
Yeah, I mean, and I can tell you, we had to do that both at annual meeting and spring lobby weekend. Every year, even when events are in person, someone gets sick, someone stubs a toe, whatever it might be. But now you also have all the technical glitches that can pop up. So it's really helpful to just be able to have, a very easy, someone can just step in and take in a role, and it can be pretty seamless. So talking again about annual meeting, this was a 4-day event. When it was in person, we did decide to keep it in that 4-day format when we took it online. And that is 2 days of business and 2 days of lobby training and lobbying. So that event took place over both Zoom meetings and also a live stream on YouTube. So our plenaries were on YouTube and our business and workshops happened on Zoom meetings. And whether or not you decide to actually stream to YouTube, what's important to think about when you're thinking about what is the format that the programming should take is if it's a webinar or a meeting is how interactive you want it to be with the audience. So we found that for our workshops and for business, it was critically important that we could see people like we can now. You all can unmute, you can raise your hand. It can be very participatory versus our plenaries where we had, maybe an hour and a half of lobby training, speakers. It was a really tight script. There's lots of just information going out. We felt like we could just get the interactivity that we needed through questions in the Zoom, in the chat box rather. So that's sort of how we made that decision, is how interactive do we want these different places to be, and how much of that sense of community do you want people to feel at various points, because being able to look out and see other folks that are there really adds to that sense of community. The days were also shorter than when we were in person, though they were still long. So when we meet in person in Washington, D.C., it's basically 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning to 8 or 9 o'clock at night with, some breaks, but it's a very full day. And we knew we couldn't do that online. We knew that that was asking a lot of people to be in front of a computer. So, and we had time zones to think about. So we started with optional programming at 11, kicked it off in earnest at noon Eastern time, and then wrapped up each day by 5 or 6. So it was still a long day. There were breaks in there, but when we talk about pitfalls, I think planning in more of those breaks and being really obvious about when the optional programming is so people can step away and take a moment for themselves is a really important aspect of when you're thinking about these larger scale events. A few tips. So a couple more, I have a few more things to say. We found that it was really important to send out a printed program before our major conferences so that people actually had something they could hold on to, they could flip through. Right now, I've got quite a few boxes up on my screen. And if I was also trying to, just browse through what else is happening this day or speaker bios, it might be a little too much for some people who are on a laptop or a tablet. So we did weigh out the idea that sending, being a little less eco-friendly by sending out that mailing, but we really felt like for our audience, it would make a big difference, especially in our first virtual annual meeting where we knew everyone's comfort level wasn't going to be at the same level. We also decided for all of our Zoom meetings, we had one passcode for everything. So it was annual meeting 2020. Our passcode was AM 2020. Really easy. We said it 100 times throughout, but we didn't post it on the main website anywhere. And that was just for Zoom security. So we were sure that all the folks who should be there were there. I also really recommend taking the time to do rehearsals. Bobby and I rehearsed for this, and it can sometimes feel a little silly to sit down and talk to each other through the programming. But what I found is that when we did that with our clerks of our standing committees, folks came in thinking they understood what business was going to feel like. And then once they were there, they realized all these questions they had or things that they thought were going to happen one way were actually happening another way. And it was really great to work through all of those questions before we went live in the conference. It's also really important. We found it was really important to have 3 different people that had different roles in all of our sessions. So we had a tech person who was responsible for, at least one tech person who was responsible for running all of the tech of Zoom. If there were polls, if there were breakout rooms, they were in control of those things. Then we also would have the presenter, and it was really important that the presenter was not the person running tech, so that in case something came up, they could just stay focused on being the talent, as it were. And then we also had an interrupter, and this was something that we chose to do as a DEI, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort. Did we have a question here?
I just saw Anne's question. Did we remember to start recording? To record? Yes.
I think
okay.
Bobby got us. We're good. Thank you. Thank you for checking on that. And then the last, I've spoken a lot. So the last thing that I'll say is our daily emails were also incredibly useful. So we actually planned out in advance what was the general information that we wanted to send out each evening, with reminders, Zoom links, reminder of the passcode, anything else, any other information that we thought was really important for folks to remember and have top of mind the next day. But also it gave us an opportunity each night to get together with our communications team and say, oh, X, Y, or Z came up. We should make an announcement about this. A few people have asked about this question. Let's add that into the email. So it was just a really helpful touch point each night to also sort of reflect on, are there any changes we need to make going into the next day? But with that, I'll turn it over to Bobby.
Thanks, Annie. So we got a little bit of the nuts and bolts and tips and tricks for big online Quaker gatherings. These were in reference to one of our big annual conferences that we put on each year. I'm going to talk a little bit about an ongoing weekly event that I run called FCNL's Witness Wednesday Silent Reflection, which has sort of become an unaffiliated independent worship group of friends, seekers, other folks from around the country who may participate in FCNL's advocacy, but not know about its Quaker background and grounding as an organization. So it's a really kind of beautiful melange of people of different backgrounds who come together to share a practice that we call silent reflection, to keep it open-ended and for people coming to that space for various experiences. We do, talk about it being patterned after Quaker worship. And if you're there as a Quaker, you can definitely experience Quaker worship in that space. But we wanted to not define it by that experience, to be as welcoming and inclusive as possible. So just some of the quick nuts and bolts for how we actually make that happen. On our FCNL website, we have event postings and registration pages that people can sign up to attend a particular weekly session. And then they get a confirmation email with the Zoom information to join. And we just have a standing sort of recurring Zoom meeting that we run this program in every week, so we don't have to change the link, and people can just remember it's that link to join each week once they've come once. We also use some just slides to post up the sort of query that we're using that each week. We invite different members of our community, staff at FCNL, advocates in the network, folks in our general committee, to actually host that space and bring a piece of wisdom, a quote, a query, a piece of scripture, whatever speaking to them, into that space to help guide the group's reflection and time of worship together. And what we found to be really important in that space, from feedback from participants, is they really love the feeling of community. They're able to get there. And a few ways that we cultivate that is to build in opportunities to share and to connect, like we heard a lot about during the morning panel. So at first, what that looked like, when we were a relatively small group at the start of the pandemic, it was only about 15 of us each week. We would actually just do a pretty standard after worship fellowship time where we'd go around and introduce ourselves, say where we're coming from, offer up any afterthoughts that were rising for us, and share joys and concerns. However, as the community has grown, we now have about 40 weekly participants who are joining us from around the country and sometimes from across oceans to worship with us. We found that we can't actually go around and give each person a few minutes to share because it just becomes too cumbersome. So what we've innovated for that is what a lot of meetings are doing these days, just opening optional breakout rooms at the end of worship that people can go into in groups of 3 or 4, introduce themselves, say where they're from, and share those afterthoughts, joys, and concerns that way. And people end up in different breakout rooms each week. So over time, there's really a sense of group cohesion that emerges out of that opportunity to share with multiple small groups that are, have different people in them. All right, I think I'm going to pass it back to Annie to start us off on Pitfalls, which is basically we've made some mistakes in transitioning our programming to virtual. And a big part of how we're going to talk about these pitfalls and the advice we have is to really try to just anticipate what could go wrong and have a plan for what you'll do if it does. And then to sort of try to set things up in your virtual events to prevent those scenarios from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. So in terms of major events, one of the things that I've learned is that basically no matter what, the first day of the conference is the rockiest. Everyone's figuring things out. And by everyone, I don't just mean the people who are running the event, but also attendees. And it takes a little bit to get used to the pace and, the way that we're asking for participation and, Zoom links maybe being broken, anything like that. The first day is usually going to be the rockiest. So just think about your scheduling accordingly. Make sure that there's enough breaks, make sure that there's times for people who have questions. There's ways for those questions to get answered because that's definitely day one is where you'll get the most of that. We found that we needed more buffer time and needed more unprogrammed hangout time. Just because our day, as I said, didn't start in earnest till noon, but noon to 5 or noon to 6, even with 15-minute breaks in, is still a long time to be at a computer, and people just need a little bit more time to decompress. We also learned that it was a mistake to schedule back-to-back Zoom meetings on the same account, because if one meeting runs over, when the host leaves that meeting, even if they make someone else a host when they leave so the meeting can continue, once they start a new meeting on their account, it shuts off that first meeting and it will just cut it off very abruptly, a little bit rudely. And that happened a couple times when our lobby trainings went long with a few folks who had to skedaddle to their next Zoom meeting. Even with optional programming and shorter days than in person, I would just say you're still going to lose people through the day. So really thinking about, your most important programming probably should be in those first couple hours of the day, not in the last couple hours of the day. And Bobby?
Yeah, and one other thing here, if you're thinking about planning events where there's business involved, part of my role at FCNL is to visit all of our affiliated yearly meetings and sit in on their business sessions, provide updates on the FCNL, on what FCNL's been doing this year, et cetera. And something that I've really seen as a great innovation at the yearly meeting level is to have sort of an extra business meeting or two just scheduled without an agenda plan to account for spillover. I think we always like to think optimistically about business, then that we can get everything accomplished in the time we've set aside. But it's different on Zoom. It feels even more pressed, even more tighter, and like there's less room for spirit. So building in some spaciousness with an extra business session or two scheduled, I've seen it just to be very effective, because then you're confident you have a time and place where you can lay over agenda items for continued discussion. And that way you just don't feel as rushed, and you have an ability to shift how much time, if a conversation or a piece of discernment really needs more time given to it, you have some flexibility to do that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our pitfalls in cultivating and stewarding a weekly worship space as well. On the nuts and bolts front for Witness Wednesday Silent Reflection that FCNL runs each week, we figured out pretty quickly that we needed to turn off entry and exit chimes, because that can be really disruptive to settling into a worshipful state of mind. And we also decided, and it also makes it harder for someone to leave with some subtlety. Like if they need to slip out or something, they don't have to announce to the whole group that's worshiping that they've left. So turning off the entry and exit chimes has really helped us. Another thing is, as Annie talked about earlier, we started using passcodes so that we're able to turn off the waiting room. And that's just really helpful for your tech person, honestly, because it's a lot of bandwidth to be, admitting people from the waiting room, to be advancing slides if you're screen sharing, and to be announcing any tech housekeeping parts that you might need to share with your audience at the start of an event. So that's just been helpful, honestly. Personally, I innovated that because I was finding it difficult to control all these different tech responsibilities at the same time. Now that we're getting into sort of a larger group, and it looks like we're going to have a more sustained worship opportunity on Zoom for a while, we've also started conversations about what does care of worship look like when you're facilitating a worship space that isn't affiliated with a monthly meeting or under the care of a monthly meeting, and you don't have those typical structures like ministry and worship committees to help hold the gathered community and to help nurture worship. So we've started to reach out to some of our regulars to form sort of an informal committee to pay attention to how worship is each week and to give feedback on what could be changed and to support members of the worshiping community as needed. We've also found that breakout rooms in general have been a fix for a lot of things. So we did experience a need for Zoom eldering at various points where there was some harmful or misaligned ministry shared that other members of the worshiping community didn't appreciate or that they were injured by. We found that the incident of that happening really went down when we stopped doing introductions in the full group and people felt like they had less of kind of a pulpit to preach from. And also that made it easier for if any eldering or sort of gentle conversations and reminders needed to be had, they could also happen in breakout rooms more easily than in the full group in Zoom. I think that's honestly most of what we had to share with you all. Sorry, really quick, lots of different pieces here, but we do have a set of queries that we'd like to offer you all in sharing your wisdom with other folks gathered here. I put them in the chat, but I can read them as well. And of course, we can also take questions if you all have any about what we presented on. But what mistakes have you made in planning and implementing online Quaker gatherings or events? What have you learned from your mistakes? What do you still find most challenging about online Quaker gatherings and events? What innovations have enhanced your experience of online Quaker gatherings? How have you incorporated a Quaker flavor into your virtual spaces or seen others do the same? And how have you seen accessibility or access needs addressed or met in online Quaker spaces? You can speak to any of those that call something up in you.
I could say a couple of things that relate to two of these questions. So this refers to, I'm Jeannie Stower's Berkeley meeting, and this was in our Social and Environmental Action Committee, which I clerk. And at the beginning of the pandemic and when we were just starting, I was very focused on security of our meetings and as was, I think, most everybody at that point. So I was changing the Zoom link every month for our meeting and found that it was creating a big problem for one of our members who is blind and has an assistant come in to help him every week. And I was so busy with my own work this year, being everything on Zoom. I teach in a university and I was just swamped. I wasn't able to get everything done for the committee meeting by Thursday when his assistant is there. So that was one problem, and I've had to adjust. I've had to adjust accordingly, but also I just finally had to just give in and use the same link all the time so that he could get in. And once I clearly understood that that was the issue, we had some communication problems before I was able to understand that that was the problem it was causing him problems. I think we were able to do it, but because he could only, and I just have to be really aware in our meetings because he joins by phone and be aware of what he can't see. And so that we just have to read out basically. So I think that's just part of awareness, but it did take some working out basically to accommodate everybody. And I guess that would be my question to you at some point. At the beginning, there were lots of rumors about, Zoom busts and people breaking in and stuff. And, I'm wondering how reality-based all those concerns actually were and how much, if you saw those security issues happening or not. I know at our university, there were a couple of Zoom meetings that got busted into basically. But, as a percentage, I don't think it was very high.
Yeah, I can take a crack at this, and I'm sure Annie has more to say as well. Personally, I have never had an instance of Zoom security issues during FCNL online events using Zoom. However, and Annie can speak more to this, we had researched a very extensive protocol for what to do if there was an instance of Zoom bombing, as it has become known colloquially. And maybe I'll just pass it to her to talk more about that.
Yeah, so agreed. Our mentality was, bring a raincoat and then it won't rain. So we had at the top of all of our, and I just will say, I think maybe the timing wasn't set right. So we might get kicked out of these rooms in about 2.5 minutes, but we can come back in, I think, once we're back in the main room. So at the beginning of all of our run of show documents, we actually just had there for anyone running tech, what the quick 30 seconds of steps are that you can do if that does arise. And so there's actually, when you're a host, you can see, I can't see this here because I'm not a host or a co-host, but there's a little shield security sign, and that's where you can enable or disable the waiting room. You can make it so that people can't rename themselves, which is important because if someone's very good at Zoom interruption, they can just keep renaming themselves so that you can't get them out of the meeting. You can make it so people can't unmute themselves or can't turn their cameras on. So you have control to really quickly basically lock down the meeting if that does happen and take away chat until you get the person out or the person's out who are being disruptive. And then you can carry on. So we actually didn't have an issue with anyone who wasn't initially supposed to be in our meetings, but I will say during Spring Lobby Weekend, we did have a friend who just wasn't following community guidelines. So we did have to use a little bit of that there, but it wasn't an unknown entity to FCNL when that happened. But usually it's just better safe than sorry. It's not something you generally have to use.
Yeah, Ron here. I haven't done any of this. I've done our meeting level Zoom things. I had a question for you. What is the cost of the Zoom accounts that handle what you're doing, or do you use webinar, or what's the?
That's a really good question, Ron. So it really depends. So the standard Zoom Pro, where I think you can have up to 100 people in a meeting, that's pretty inexpensive. It's about $10 a month, I want to say. It changes depending on what you need for a webinar versus I think the next level up is 500. Then you can go to 1,000. Then you can give even more. But when you start to go to the 500 and above level, it does start to be more like, $50, $80, $100 per month per Zoom account. What's nice about Zoom is that it is monthly. So we upgrade a bunch of Zoom accounts for the month of the conference and then pay for them just for that month and then come back down to folks having the low cost or the free options. I do think we're about to get kicked out, but maybe not. We're still here.
We're still here.
Have you done hybrid? I mean, in other words, where part of you is in a big room with the little video roaming around, plus everybody else on their own?
So we've yet to do that. It's something we're considering for our upcoming November meeting. We're in the grips of trying to figure out what's the most optimal and safest way for us to gather this coming November. It's a wonderful thing that vaccines are rolling out and there's hope and we're seeing light at the end of that proverbial tunnel, but it is it becomes a lot trickier to figure out what is that hybrid model. In my case, for virtual, for major conferences, another added layer of complication is that we do have to work with the contracted AV folks at the hotel. And what they're able to offer in terms of their tech looks a lot more like a very standard live stream where perhaps there's a chat function where people can ask questions, but a lot of the Zoom meeting interactivity that we've come to really appreciate, especially in Quaker meetings where it's really important that it's participatory, that becomes a bigger challenge. And that's really what we're trying to figure out now is would a hybrid event really look like? There'd be two sets of programming happening at once. And sometimes that programming would come together, but would there be a need for, a set of in-person workshops and a set of online workshops? And so we're trying to start to figure that out now. And we're very fortunate to have the benefit of a summer of yearly meetings gathering and getting to learn from some of them. And that was really valuable last year too. David Coletta, who I saw was here, he was one of the folks who really helped us in a huge way trailblaze what we are going to do for a totally virtual conference. So I think we've gotten good at that. And the next big thing that we have to innovate is how to do that hybrid. I know one idea that's come up is because this could also be adapted more easily if there are, if things start to look like there's more spikes or variants or whatever it might be, of thinking of hybrid as really community watch parties where people aren't traveling large distances, but if it's safe in your community, you could be in a group of 10, 15 people. But then something to think about there is if you're recognizing people to speak, how you do that when in the main conference setting, there's just the one square you're seeing, but that one square represents 20 people. So, there's lots of more questions, I think, than answers that we have at this point. But as you all start to see different gatherings take that hybrid format, we are going to also be looking out for that and seeing what lessons we can learn. But right now it's still a lot of questions.
I'm so glad we're still on. I have an issue with being both the clerk and the host of our meeting. And I really like the concept of having 3 different people involved with every single thing, because it's hard enough to clerk, but to be thinking about, special effects and yada, yada, it's just overwhelming. So I'm going to carry that back. Also, when we go back to in person, we have a member who lives out of the whole area. So we will need to continue, but we don't have any Wi-Fi permission at the food bank where we've been meeting. So is anybody using a hotspot to connect their meeting house?
When it started, our meeting house did not have Wi-Fi, and I had to run 350 feet of cable and put it in. But I know that wouldn't fit your situation with a food bank.
I was in a different state from the meeting at the time that we went on Zoom and did not have connectivity where I was. So I bought a hotspot. I have Verizon phone service, bought a Verizon hotspot for $20 a month. Was able to run Zoom meetings from Washington down to California. And that worked out really amazingly well. It's just a small thing, and plug it in and it goes. We have I can handle up to 49 people on our Zoom account. I think the jump to where you get breakout rooms is a lot of money in terms of stepping up. And I'm wondering if anybody has experience with OWL, which is a rotating, seeking the source of the sound and then showing that person that picture. If anybody has experience with that, we're thinking about it, but that also is quite expensive. And we're wondering if it's worth it at this point. We've kind of rigged something with just extra speakers to project what the people on Zoom are saying into the room, and an extra microphone mounted near the ceiling that will pick up what people in the room are saying and can be heard with people on Zoom. And that's just two things that plugs into my laptop. And that seems to be working well. We've run a couple of tests with that. And although there is a little delay and the sound coming from the room to the people at home is a little bit fuzzy, we think it will work. We think it's good enough, but we are just about to launch this thing and try. The other thing that I'd like to mention also to the larger group is that we're thinking about time splitting and having one session for people on Zoom, because it's probably most convenient for them. One session that would be Zoom and in the meeting room. And that would be for like adult ed programs, and then one worship for people only in the meeting room. So we're thinking about dividing the time rather than dividing space. That's up for discussion. We'll see. I don't know what's going to be acceptable, but we're going to survey people on that. And also the issue of folks who are really very opposed to Zoom, do not Zoom and would not participate with pictures up on the wall. But I'm going back for a second round of surveys with them to ask them if just the audio would be acceptable. And there's one person who had said, I'm never Zooming, who said, yeah, I might sit in the room with that and at least try it. So we're getting over some of the hesitancy about it because they've been hearing about it, and I'm sure they've had some experience watching something. So yeah, I feel like we're getting our toes in the water now, and it's time to just hold my nose and jump.
I will say I'm super intrigued by the OWL device also, the Meeting Owl that is omnidirectional webcam that points towards where it hears sound coming from. So theoretically, I could be speaking in the corner of the room and the webcam would swivel over to look at me and center in on my face while I'm speaking. We haven't experimented with that yet at FCNL, but I'm thinking we'll likely, as we start reopening, pilot that and various other solutions. I do know that David Coletta has one for New England yearly meeting, and they've been sort of wrenching it out to different meetings to try it. So he's a great person to touch base with about that specific technology. And I'll also give a quick plug for the Facebook group called Quaker Gatherings online. And it's something that Kathleen Wooten from New England Yearly Meeting moderates. And it's a great resource, like a clearinghouse truly of all these kinds of questions that come up, especially right now around hybrid meetings. So there's people who've posted their spreadsheets of the equipment setup they're using and what each piece of equipment costs, case studies of just different setups so that people can kind of review those and see what might work for their community. I'll drop a link to that Facebook group in the chat momentarily.
We had I think it was a pretty nifty microphone system. Maybe 20 years ago, somebody installed one of those things where you have a wire running around the perimeter of the room, and we have 6 microphones for the hearing assist system for people that need hearing. We have a large space, and so, you know, we just had that system all those years. And I found I could just buy a Linksys dongle, and I plug the headset through that little thumb drive looking thing into the computer. So the Zoom people hear very well. You know, anybody speaking in the room is very easily picked up on that system with no delay. It's not Bluetooth, in other words. It's that hearing assist system.
I'll also make a quick plug for those friends here interested in discussing hybrid gatherings and meetings more directly, more on the nose. I know there's another roundtable happening with Jay Cash and Kathleen Wooten that's specifically addressing kind of the future of worship in person, hybrid, and blended together. So for round 2, that might be a place to hear from some folks who have been doing a little bit more research than Annie and I have at this point in the year.
So,
I would like to say I have been so impressed by FCNL this year, more than any other organization with which I'm affiliated. FCNL appeared to make the transition very seamlessly to actually providing useful and interesting programming, that allowed a community not just to exist, but to expand in ways that we hadn't been able to before the pandemic. The Thursdays with friends and the Wednesdays, the Witness Wednesdays were just great, I thought, innovations. And I love the ones that I could go to, and just seeing people from all over the country. And I hope that those would, might continue in some form, after, we all go back to whatever we're going back to physically. But kudos on, your efforts and willingness to innovate, really, and and just put it out there and try things. They have been much appreciated, I think, across the country.
Thanks, Janie and Grace. Oh, thank you both so much. I appreciate all of you, truly. Yeah, it was actually a funny story with Witness Wednesday Silent Reflection. That is a program that we had running since before the pandemic. But because it wasn't hybrid, because it was literally just every Wednesday, if you're walking by the FCNL office and you see our sandwich board saying that Quaker worship is being held, that you come in and participate, we weren't getting a lot of attendees. It was mostly 3 or 4 staff members each week and maybe 1 or 2 visitors from out of town or passersby. And now we have a worshiping community of 40 plus people who gather from all over the country each week. And it's just continuing to grow. So I definitely think we'll be keeping that one virtual or hybrid, but we're definitely very pleased with the expanded participation. Kind of getting back to your point, Jeannie, about how we've been able to use these virtual opportunities to expand our community and invite more people into it.
So what does your summer schedule for visiting yearly meetings look like? Is that in person?
Currently, it's all virtual still.
So it's still all virtual.
Yeah, most yearly meetings that I've been in touch with thus far are doing virtual. A few are trying hybrid settings, but no one I've talked to yet is only doing in person. So until we're able to have more widespread vaccine coverage, we just don't feel super comfortable asking our staff to travel physically. But we will be looking at restarting travel probably in the fall to some degree. So for the next yearly meeting cycle, we'll be back visiting in person.
I came into the room a little late, but has FCNL made a decision about next fall's gathering, about whether it's going to be?
We haven't yet. So we're in the throes of making that decision. And I know we're planning on sending out a survey to our general committee in the coming couple of weeks to just start to gauge what people's comfortability is with the idea of being in person to some degree. Our thinking is that even if we are in person, it's going to be significantly smaller than the 400 plus gathering that we've had in the before times. So we really are anticipating at most what we are likely, because annual meeting is 2 events in one. It's actually many more than that, but the 2 major events in one are the business for 2 days and then the lobbying for the 2 days. What we're thinking right now is that if any part of it were to happen in that hybrid in-person model, the business would be the part that'd be most likely. The lobbying and the lobby training, I anticipate will likely be 100% virtual, in no small part because people still aren't allowed in the Capitol yet. And we're not overly optimistic that people will be allowed in the Capitol in November. So there's not, and also I would say, our business session is really mainly just our members of the general committee attend that is 200 or less people. So imagining about 100 people actually came to DC, like those are the numbers we're thinking of. Whereas we have hundreds of folks who are on advocacy teams, who are advocates, who are parts of our network, who join us for the lobbying. And that is where capping that number at a number that feels safe starts to get a little untenable as well. So we're kind of forced to think about the two parts of the event a little differently. And it's exciting though. It's allowing us to think outside the box, possibly have things happen over 2 different weekends. Like we haven't made any decisions yet, but I think one of the, I appreciate you saying that you like our online programming and that it's allowed so many more people to attend. And I really appreciate that about online programming too. We had so many first-time attenders. Normally for annual meeting, our first-time attenders are around 20% of attendees. This last year, it was something like 60 or 70% of attendees were first-time attenders. And we surveyed folks afterwards, asking them if they would attend again. And most of the people who took the survey, who it was their first time attending, said they would only come back again if it was virtual. So it does really feel like virtual is going to be part of our lives moving forward. And these online ways of accessing these gatherings aren't going anywhere. Now, I think the hardest and murkiest water is yet ahead of how we do that in a hybrid setting. But I feel really confident that, we're going to see lots of really great innovation in the next year or two, and we're going to get good at it.
Just another comment about that. I feel like we've got like the virtual, because I'm in an advocacy team of virtual meetings, lobby visits kind of down. And in California, it's enabled us to overcome the continuing problem we had was to how to deal with, we have 10 teams across the state with lobbying our senators. So like we've had 60 people from all over the state, our last couple lobby visits with the senators, and it's just had an enormous impact. And, I certainly hope that we're going to be able to continue doing something like that. Because otherwise, the Northern office would say, oh, we've just seen you guys in the Southern office. And it was just a continuing issue. I like this idea of splitting it up. I think that would be very workable.
We had quite a bit of problem with freezing up in the first couple of months that we worked on that. Is like Chromebook and tablets less effective in pulling in Zoom signals?
I think that the main processor size has a big impact. So a laptop will tend to have a much faster processor, I think. But Bobby and Annie probably know more.
I was going to say thanks for taking that, Ron, because we are definitely not tech aficionados when it comes to bandwidth and video and not freezing up or freezing up. I'm on a laptop for work right now and most of the time. And I've actually just been having trouble with my own Zoom video bandwidth because my my router is so far away from my room in my house. Mm-hmm. So I've started to research actually Wi-Fi boosters and extenders to see what's the best solution to make sure that my video for my workspace doesn't even break up.
The other thing I notice is when attendees are on tablets, those are usually the folks who I'm left with in the main room trying to help get into breakout rooms. I think every tablet, it shows up a little bit differently for them, and it can be very difficult as the tech person when you can't see the screen that someone else sees to help them navigate to that breakout room. So it's a lot of, do you see 4 squares? Look, tap on the screen and see if 4 squares pop up that says, so there's a lot of just talking people through that.
Yeah, that's another piece that it reminded me of. It's just like trying to give tech instructions during events for all of the possible interfaces that people might be working with. just sort of isn't realistic most of the time, because people could be joining from their phone, from tablets, from Chromebooks, it might look different on a Mac versus a PC. So I think, we sort of started to give more general instructions rather than like, look at the bottom left of your screen to find the mute button, because it's not there for everyone. It was just like, wherever your Zoom controls are, look for this, what the button looks like, and press that. It was just an interesting learning that we had to get used to pretty quickly.
And I think, unfortunately, one of the best tricks for freezing is to just simply turn off your device and reboot it. I've had that work on, on any device. At our meeting house, I run the hybrid computer, sit there with the hybrid laptop. And I pretty much do that every week before I start. I just turn it off and, give it a fresh start.
And this might be old hat by now, but sometimes just turning off your video like I'm doing right now can help with bandwidth issues. And at least that way you can still communicate with folks, even if the video might be freezing. So sometimes when I start freezing up, I'll try this approach. Do you want to give a quick time check? I think we only have about 2 more minutes before we'll take a quick 10 or 15-minute break between roundtable sessions. So any last thoughts or shares?
I want to shout out to the people who, like me, have stepped into this role with like no experience except word processing. When I told my Google techie stepson that I was the tech person at the meeting, he laughed. And I said, "You're laughing. I'm crying. You better answer my phone calls when I call you, because I need help during meeting for worship." And he goes, "I sleep late on Sunday mornings." I said, "Not anymore." So, and he doesn't answer the phone. So, yeah.
Good for you. Good for
Pat
you.
ourselves on the back.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a good tip, actually, is to have an iPhone handy separately, right? For that secret, desperate call that you can, yeah. And maybe have it on headphones if you're in the meeting house room or something.
Yeah. I think, friends, at least in South Carolina, we have to face the fact that not everybody has broadband access. Not everybody has the equipment, and some people have their power turned off because they couldn't pay their bill. And how do we respond to that? So not for now, but we need to be thinking about letting people be included that just might need a laptop.
And sort of on that point, and to Charlene's shout out, I think what I'm hoping for in the broader Religious Society of Friends is that tech ministry will be actually seen as such. It is truly a ministry and a service to the community. We're actually at my meeting, at Friends Meeting of Washington in DC, we're currently in discernment over whether we want to provide compensation for our Zoom hosts, because it takes you out of the experience of meeting for worship, to be monitoring everything, to be keeping the meeting safe, to be, answering tech support requests. You're not actually in meeting for worship usually. So I think it's an ongoing live discussion that I hope more of our Quaker communities will have in recognizing that as a ministry.
Thank you all so
Thank you
much
so
for
much,
being
friends.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
This
really
was
helpful.
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
It was
Appreciate
wonderful
it.
being with you.